What if I told you that beneath the polished stones of Europe's grandest cathedrals lies a secret so dangerous it could unravel 15 centuries of carefully constructed history? What if the bloodline you've been taught to revere wasn't the first, wasn't the only, and perhaps wasn't even the most sacred? You've heard whispers of the Knights Templar, those mysterious warrior monks who supposedly guarded holy relics and ancient secrets. But what if they weren't the beginning of this story? What if they were merely inheriting something far older, far more profound, something that had been flowing like an underground river through the veins of European royalty for 300 years before they ever set foot in Jerusalem? Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me guide you through shadows that history tried desperately to erase. We're going to uncover the Merovingian Code, a mystery that begins not with crusading knights or papal bulls, but with a dynasty of kings whose very blood was considered divine. Kings who never cut their hair because it held their power. Kings who ruled not by conquest, but by birthright. Kings who claimed descent from something or someone that made Rome itself tremble. This isn't just another tale of medieval politics or forgotten monarchs. This is the story of a bloodline that threatened the very foundation of Christian authority, a lineage so dangerous that it had to be erased, buried, and forgotten. Yet somehow, impossibly, traces of it survived, hidden in symbols, encoded in architecture, whispered in legends that refuse to die. But to understand this mystery, you need to slow your breathing, let your mind drift back through centuries of carefully constructed lies, and prepare yourself for a truth that's been sleeping in shadows for over 1,000 years. Picture the mist rolling across the forests of ancient Gaul. The year is 481, and the Roman Empire is crumbling like old parchment. In this chaos, a young king rises to power, but he's unlike any ruler the world has seen. His name is Clovis, and he's the first of a dynasty that will change everything. His hair flows like golden silk down his back, never touched by blade or shear, because to cut it would be to sever his connection to the divine. The Merovingians weren't ordinary kings. They were the Rex Crinitus, the long-haired kings. And their subjects didn't just obey them, they worshipped them. These weren't men who claimed divine right through papal blessing or military might. They claimed something far more intimate, far more dangerous. They claimed divine blood. For 3 centuries, from the collapse of Rome to the rise of Charlemagne, the Merovingians ruled over what would become France, Germany, and Belgium. Their courts were places of mystery and wonder, where kings were said to heal with a touch, where visions came in dreams, where the boundary between earthly and heavenly power dissolved like morning fog. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The Merovingians claimed their divine nature didn't come from God's blessing. It came from God's bloodline. They whispered, in hushed voices behind stone walls, that their ancestor wasn't just any holy figure. Their ancestor was the holiest figure of all. Now let your imagination drift further back, past the mists of Gaul, past the fall of Rome, to a small village in 1st century Palestine. Picture a carpenter's son, a teacher, a man who walked on water and spoke of love conquering death. But what if that man, before his crucifixion, had lived not just as a teacher, but as a husband? What if Mary Magdalene was more than a devoted follower? What if she carried within her womb not just faith, but legacy? This is the whisper that haunted the Merovingians, the secret that made their blood sacred, and their rule legitimate in ways that terrified the early Christian church. Because if Jesus had children, if his bloodline survived, if it flowed through the veins of Frankish kings, then the entire structure of papal authority would crumble overnight. Think about it. The church's power rested on the idea that Christ's legacy lived through apostolic succession, through Peter and his spiritual descendants. But what if there were biological descendants? What if the Holy Grail wasn't a cup at all, but a womb? What if the sacred vessel that carried Christ's essence wasn't made of gold or silver, but of flesh and blood? The Merovingians believed this with every fibre of their being. They saw themselves not as mere mortals elevated by divine grace, but as living relics, walking embodiments of the sacred. Their long hair wasn't just tradition, it was theology made visible. Like Samson in the Old Testament, their strength, their legitimacy, their very souls were bound up in those flowing locks that connected them to their divine ancestor. But power this pure, this threatening, couldn't last forever. By the 8th century, the church had grown strong enough to challenge even sacred bloodlines. The mayors of the palace, originally servants of the Merovingian kings, had accumulated real power, while their divine masters remained symbols. And in 751, everything changed. Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was quietly deposed. Not executed, not exiled, but sent to a monastery where his sacred hair was shorn and his divine power severed forever. In his place rose Pepin the Short, founder of the Carolingian dynasty, blessed not by ancient bloodline, but by papal approval. The church had successfully replaced divine genetics with ecclesiastical politics, or so they thought. Because here's where the mystery deepens, where the code begins to reveal itself. The Merovingians didn't simply vanish into history books. Their bloodline didn't end with a pair of scissors in a monastery cell. Something survived, something was preserved, something was hidden so carefully that it would take 12 centuries for the world to even begin to suspect its existence. The evidence is scattered like breadcrumbs across the landscape of European history. A bee carved into a tomb that shouldn't be there. A symbol appearing in places separated by centuries and continents. A genealogy that traces noble families back to bloodlines that officially ended in the 8th century. A persistent legend that Mary Magdalene fled to southern France, carrying with her not just memories of the crucifixion, but hope for the future. And perhaps most intriguingly, the emergence centuries later of military orders like the Knights Templar, who seemed to know secrets that predated their founding, who dug beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, not for treasure, but for truth, who protected pilgrims, but perhaps protected something far more precious, something that connected the Holy Land to the forests of France, in ways that official history refuses to acknowledge. The Merovingian Code isn't just about forgotten kings or alternative gospels. It's about the possibility that the most sacred story in human history has chapters that were deliberately torn out, burned, and buried. It's about bloodlines that refused to die, secrets that found new guardians, and truths that coded themselves into symbols, architecture, and legend, waiting for someone brave enough to decode them. As your eyelids grow heavy and your breathing slows, let yourself drift deeper into this labyrinth of hidden history. Because the story doesn't end with the Templars, or even with the fall of the Merovingians. It stretches like a golden thread through centuries of shadow, weaving itself into the very fabric of the world you know today. Picture yourself walking through the great museums of Europe. You pass paintings by Leonardo da Vinci, and something catches your eye. In the Last Supper, that figure beside Christ, traditionally called John, looks remarkably feminine. The pose, the features, the way the composition creates a perfect V-shape between Jesus and this mysterious companion. Was Leonardo trying to tell us something? Was he encoding a truth that couldn't be spoken aloud in his time? The Renaissance masters weren't just artists, they were custodians of dangerous knowledge. They lived in an age when heresy meant death, when the Inquisition burned books and bodies with equal fervour. But they were also men of learning, connected to secret societies, mystery schools, and ancient traditions that predated Christianity itself. If the Merovingian bloodline had survived, if it had been protected by hidden guardians, wouldn't these masters of symbolism be exactly the kind of people entrusted with preserving its memory? Now let your mind wander to the great cathedrals that pierce the European skyline. Notre Dame, Chartres, Reims. These aren't just houses of worship, they're books written in stone. Every arch, every rose window, every carved figure tells a story. And hidden within that story, encoded in sacred geometry and mystical symbolism, might be the greatest secret of all. The bee appears again and again. In royal regalia, in family crests, in the hidden corners of ancient manuscripts. Even Napoleon, centuries after the Merovingians supposedly vanished, chose the bee as his imperial symbol. Was this coincidence? Or was the little emperor trying to connect himself to something far older than the Roman eagles he claimed to inherit? But perhaps the most compelling evidence lies not in museums or cathedrals, but in the bloodlines themselves. Modern genealogy has revealed something startling. Many of Europe's royal families, despite centuries of war, revolution, and political upheaval, can trace their ancestry back to common sources. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Windsors, they're all connected by marriage and bloodline to the noble houses of medieval France. And those houses, if you trace them back far enough, dissolve into the mists of the early Middle Ages, to a time when the Merovingians ruled and divine blood was more than metaphor. Today, in quiet corners of southern France, there are families who've never sought crowns or recognition, who keep their genealogies in private libraries, who pass down stories that their ancestors told them never to share with outsiders. Stories of a red-haired woman who arrived by boat, of children born under strange stars, of a bloodline that chose to survive in shadow rather than reclaim the throne. DNA testing has revolutionized our understanding of human migration and ancestry. But there are samples that remain untested, relics that remain unexamined, tombs that remain sealed. The Vatican's secret archives contain millions of documents, many of which have never been catalogued, never been studied. What secrets might they hold? What genealogies might they contain? What truths might they reveal about bloodlines that officially never existed? The Merovingian Code isn't really about proving or disproving a single theory. It's about recognizing that history is written by the victors, and that the victors often have very good reasons for erasing their rivals, not just from power, but from memory itself. It's about understanding that the most dangerous ideas aren't always the ones that threaten governments or armies, but the ones that threaten the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. As sleep begins to claim you, consider this possibility. What if the greatest treasure isn't gold or jewels, but knowledge? What if the Holy Grail isn't a cup waiting to be discovered in some hidden chamber, but a truth that's been walking among us all along, encoded in our DNA, preserved in our bloodlines, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? The Merovingian kings believed they carried the divine within them. Whether that belief was literal truth or sacred mythology matters less than the fact that it gave them the power to unite kingdoms, inspire armies, and create a legacy that refuses to die. Their code, their secret, their sacred mystery lives on, not in any single family or bloodline, but in the possibility that the sacred and the human were never meant to be separate. Let that thought carry you into dreams where kings with golden hair walk through misty forests, where symbols carved in stone whisper secrets across centuries, where the line between myth and memory dissolves like incense in cathedral air. The Merovingian Code endures, not because it can be proven, but because it reminds us that the most profound truths often wear the mask of legend, waiting patiently for those brave enough to look beyond the surface of official history. Sleep well, knowing that some mysteries are meant to be felt rather than solved, experienced rather than explained, carried in the heart rather than captured in the mind.